Hello, everyone. I hope you and your loved ones are all safe and healthy. Welcome again to an exciting webinar, which is all about putting digital transformation into practice. Essentially, it's how to transform effectively. And while change is inevitable, we will have to change either by choice or by circumstance beyond our control. There are things we can control organizationally and even personally to best manage it. And in this presentation, we will be, to use a phrase, keeping it real by addressing an issue we all know exists and we need to address, and that is improve or lose to shadow IT. So I know this can be a very interesting discussion that can bring up a lot, and I think you'll find today's session to really share some thoughts on how to steadily transform over time, because that is sustainable transformation, and that's the way that we can address the shadow IT challenge. So we'll also be sharing some very practical ways to navigate through the specific issues with shadow IT. And as a little hint, it's not only about technology, which we'll talk about. So this is a very vast topic, and we'll be addressing it at a very high level. And to walk us through this, of course, will be Kevin Baer, who is a luminary in this field, having been a CTO, CIO, and advisor to technology executives on issues like this and transformation in general. And as you are very likely already familiar, he is the co-author of one of the best-selling IT transformation books of all time, the groundbreaking The Phoenix Project, and he will be drawing on lessons from it for today's discussion. So it's a novel of organization change. If you have not read it, definitely would encourage you to read that. It's a novel of organization change, which brings to life the necessity, the challenges, and effective approaches to change. So now what is particularly exciting about this webinar is the last in a series of 3 webinars, and all of them have been recorded. So I encourage you to invite your networks as well as yourself. If you haven't seen the first 2, watch the first 2 and share them with others as well, because they are very, very valuable. And one thing that I want to invite you all to do is Kevin can literally pull several dozen lessons out of the Phoenix Project. So there is a chance that we can keep this party going and not end with webinar 3, but maybe do some more webinars as well with some more lessons from Kevin, with some more practical things that we can do, even with some more homework. So this party doesn't have to end with just these 3 webinars. We can continue this moving forward. I would encourage you, if you feel that way also, that when you do your evaluation, you can mention you'd like to have some more around this, and we could make this even something regular. So for today's agenda, what we're going to do today is Kevin will review the homework from the last webinar. So for those of you who've been with us on this journey, you know that Kevin is a great teacher and mentor, and his passion was not just to give a webinar that people get some information and move on with their lives. He really wanted us to actually change. So to have these lessons here, not just digested and understood and, oh, that was a cool webinar, but he wants these to ultimately be used, which for those of you who've been with us on the first 2 webinars, you know that there was very practical tools given, which we'll have some practical ones today as well, but there was also homework given, because that's a great way. Think of this as a master class by Kevin. It's a great way of not just sharing the information, not just sharing the knowledge, but actually applying it, practical ways to apply it. So we're going to start by going over the homework from the last week's webinar. And if you did not see that, you can rewatch that at some other time. Then after that, he will give a definition of shadow IT. We all have a definition. We're all dealing with it, whether we know it or not. But he'll be taking some time to actually talk about what shadow IT is, and then how we can take meaningful steps to improve that are very practical, that will help us dealing with shadow IT, because as the topic was improve or lose, and no one here wants to be a loser. We all want to be winners, and by taking to heart some of these lessons here, that's exactly what will happen. Then Kevin will give homework for this session as well. So, and we'll finally end up with a Q&A. So I invite you all, you can ask your questions while we're going through this session in the Q&A chat box, and we will try our best to get to as many questions as we can. We've had fantastic questions, so thank you all for showing up, for being engaged, and we look forward to a great session, and we look forward to a really engaging discussion, and we look forward to your questions as well. So with that, Kevin, I'd like to turn it to you to take us through the rest of the presentation here.
Awesome. Thanks, Yasser. I'm really excited to do this today. And we've got kind of a juggernaut of things to get through. So I'm sorry if I get too high level or hand wavy. Folks have been doing a really great job at following up with me on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, I can follow you back and we can have some direct messages. I had one gentleman win the homework award this last week. Just fabulous homework. It was Frank Vega, a guy that I already know and have worked with over the years, brilliant consultant, worked with me at Praxis Flow. But this guy responded thoughtfully to all of the homework questions in a way that really, really encouraged me. Like, A, somebody was listening, but also B, people injected their own thoughts. Frank actually expounded upon the ideas that I had, and I thought it was just really, really inspiring. So if you dig into this stuff, there's a lot there. And just like this topic, there's a lot here. So, I'm not going to get all of it. Even my definition of shadow IT is going to be the context for this conversation. There's a lot of ways to look at this. So without further ado, let's get to that homework. So we talked in the last episode about culture. And we also talked about tribalism. And I had basically pushed a book out there for you guys to consider, which was Great Boss, Dead Boss. And this is the first book that I've given you where I don't agree with a lot of what's in it, but I do agree with some really important tenets that are in this book. And so one of the things as leaders that I wanted us to be cognizant of is how we speak in our organizations. When we address each other and we broadcast, are we creating messages that divide us or help us move forward? So the first thing was I asked people, how hard is it to start a tribe? And I think you can see that the CEO starts emailing right out of the beginning of the book, and all of a sudden people start getting divided, right? And so when our plant head starts to figure out that folks are getting divided, I think it's really, really, simple to look at the examples of just even his first emails, right? And literally how these innocuous kind of emails started to ignite fear in people. And we all know that whenever there's fear and it's inside your company or inside of your organization, we will most likely see a tribe form to protect people from both their value individually and collectively, right? And their safety. So this is an important thing to understand is that literally an email, if you're a leader, sent to a group of people could create conditions that could actually make your tribalism worse. So it's very important to understand that. And because it's also important to understand what the messages can contain, foreshadowing possibility, foreshadowing the future, making a world where people can see themselves in it, but more importantly, they can see a path where they will evolve and develop capabilities to operate in. It's a confidence in your environment. So a lot of times change scares us for good reason. We know that based on our previous experience in this company, we may not have the capabilities present to actually help us through change. So sometimes it's important when you're looking at tribalism and resistance, are we just asking a very constrained group of people to change and not really giving them anything to do it with? That builds cynicism. So the other thing is, we talked about how tribes can be reunited. Now, I have this firm belief that tribes can have value outside of their polarization. They become things like guilds eventually, where our interests and our ability to kind of form, collaborative groups can form. We see this with DevOps, right? We see working across functions, right, to get a larger goal done. And with tribes, the thing we got to remember is we need to give tribes a larger goal that's bigger than them, that also makes it very clear that the enemy is not in the building. We have something bigger that we're actually trying to work against and goals that we've set as an organization. So one of the largest things leaders can do is continue to call for the things that are larger than the tribes so that the tribes can, and to talk and show how tribes must work together to accomplish that feat. Ronald Reagan said famously many years ago that he wishes there was aliens. A lot of people didn't take that right, but he said he wishes there was aliens so there wouldn't be any war on Earth at that point because we would have a common enemy. And while I don't like to frame it in terms of just enemies, I do like to say that if we have a common purpose, that purpose will help us to see that we cannot continue to operate the way we're operating. So tribes are reunited through common cause, greater purpose, common enemy must be outside of the company. The other thing is, did you start to see any situations in this that kind of reminded you of communications? And I've received some communications from folks that said, gosh, this reminded me of the first email we got during our first transformation effort that we were undergoing. And literally struck fear into everybody in these departments because keywords like rationalization of resources were mentioned in the email. This is a mention from an executive that, we're building new capabilities. What does that have to do with getting rid of existing capabilities in many cases? That's the first thing they got communicated. So not a good idea. The other thing is that OCM messaging, or organizational change management messaging, in the light of great boss, dead boss, I think pales. I think it's not sufficient the way I've seen it. And I know organizations are doing better in some cases, and some are even running communication katas, which I think are really amazing. How do we say what we mean, not say it mean, measure it and improve it? So that was the homework. Great boss, dead boss, great book. And like I said, you've got to pick and choose what you can relate with and what resonates inside of you. I am certainly not endorsing this whole book, but I do think that some of these principles are wonderful. All right, let's move on to today's topic, which is not too far from this particular topic. Excuse me while I find a cursor here. This is like my new thing that I don't like in life, which is finding cursors. All right, too many monitors. So shadow IT is our discussion today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some aspects of shadow IT. And I think it's really important to understand that shadow IT is often like a lot of things, right? In many of our organizations, we feel like, and I've seen this during digital transformations, we feel like that, there's an understanding of what we need to do, but there's also this kind of understanding that may or may not exist in management of what we have to do to keep things going, and also of the way we're incentivized and rewarded. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I actually believe shadow IT is a fundamental symptom in an organization of a lack of trust, and also maybe the lack of joining to solve a problem together versus optimizing in our local scenarios as what's best, we think, for us. So some organizations, shadow IT becomes a matter of just saying, I can't get it fast enough, right? And so I'm going to do it myself. And with the consumerization of technology, a lot of us feel like things should just be possible because, we hold up our phone and we say, hey, I can do this here. Why can't I do it at work, right? So the real question in our mind becomes these gaps that we see between what we're able to deliver at scale and what people are wanting to maybe deal with new limitations and also take advantage of new technologies. So again, shadow IT can be one of these things where there's a conflict of missions. Shadow IT can feel like on the operating end, like, hey, listen, I didn't even know that we had this thing that you bought. Because apparently all it took for you to get this service going was an Airplane magazine article and a credit card. You saw something that you wanted, we did not have it, and apparently we couldn't provide it quick enough for you, or we had an alternate solution that you didn't like. And so it becomes very easy to take that credit card, go out to said service provider, provision service, and bam, nobody knows the difference. And so whenever something happens from a security perspective, you're going to hear things like, I can't protect what I don't know exists, right? I do not have a way of knowing when you guys sign up for services. I do not have a way of making sure that all of the providers that you use actually are cohesive with our overall infrastructure plans, our security plans, our disaster recovery plans, our business continuity plans, right? All of these things need to be brought along, let alone any regulatory compliance that needs to happen, right? But we don't think of these things when we're buying stuff because we think quicker means done in this scenario. But all we've done for technology organizations is handed them a problem they already don't have time and budget to solve. And when you bought it outside of the organization, you made sure that they didn't have budget to solve it, right? So some of that impetus is actually not just related to the speed, but also the perceived cost. Because most of the time, when people are comparing service providers with internal organizations, They have no concept of all-in costs. In other words, cost of compliance, cost of security, cost of scale, all of the things that have to be thought about by an organization that's designed around many-to-one principles like operating. The other thing it can feel like, why didn't you trust me to even come with this, right? This request in some cases. There's many times we don't even hear about it in the technology organization at all until somebody in passing makes a derogatory comment like, I had to buy that because these guys couldn't do it. Well, first of all, the men and women in IT have very, very clear responsibilities that are laid out in terms of what they're supposed to do. But on the business side, there's also this kind of unmet need that I've heard a lot of people say, which is quietly, I really wish you could help me with this kind of stuff, especially with new technology. Every time I talk to you guys about it, you may be aware of it, but you don't understand how we're going to get these capabilities into the org in a way where we can be an early mover. And I think that's a legitimate question. And I think it needs to be answered thoughtfully. Instead of doing what often happens on the side is we disinvest on both sides of this situation and we basically start to criticize each other. We go ad hominem. And that doesn't really help. Matter of fact, I think in many cases, it may make it worse. You hear this phrase sometimes very angrily, depending on the situation, your solution is just too expensive. It's going to take me way too long. This lead time is going to blow my advantage. And I have no reason to believe that your lead time is even correct because I've had past experience. Also, I don't have capital budget money to buy infrastructure or the things that need to happen. I don't want to engage the program management or the project management office and have all of those layers of meetings and bureaucracy and checklists that I want to have to deal with because I'm just trying to do a simple thing, right? And also, because of your inability to do these things over time and my lack of trust, we don't have an actual relationship that I feel like we could work back and forth together. This feels very transactional to me, mostly no. So I think about shadow IT as a business person, and I'm like, I got a job to do, I understand my requirements, and I've got a corporate credit card. What else do I need? So, I think one of the important things to kind of talk about here, and Yasser, you've got a background in psychology and in kind of human factors here. And one of the things I really like to think about is, what is the climate like? I mean, when you're having these discussions, right?
Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you. You are on.
Oh, okay, great. So yeah, that's a great question. And so, as Kevin mentioned, this phenomenon of shadow IT, it seems to be accelerating, excuse me. And it's about convenience and perceived expediency. And this idea, for those of us who've been on the webinar series up till now, we wanted to use this moment to just bring up something that we talked about several times, which was psychological safety and organizational empathy. And you can't have either without trust. So the point being here is Kevin emphasized one of the key things about shadow IT is trust. When someone feels, I can trust you to get this done in a time that works for me. I can trust you to get this done in a budget that works for me. And I trust you to get it done in a way that complies with all my needs. That is, as Kevin was saying, is we haven't gotten to the solutions so much in a sense. But the idea being that one of the key underlying emotions here is cultivating that sense of trust with people that are going. And so here's the options. Option A, we cultivate that trust, and then we can help to ensure that we have that relationship so the chances of them going to shadow IT are less. Option 2, we can erode that trust or not cultivate that trust, and then the possibilities there could be that we accelerate the move to shadow IT. So with that being the case, Kevin, the big question then is, how do you begin to do that? That's the big question.
Right. And so I think it's important to kind of start to talk about this. Like, right, how do you unravel this stuff? And I think the dimensions of this there's a lot of dimensions of this, right? But I think there's also a technology side to this question, which is, I'm not budgeted for these kind of activities in some cases. I'm certainly not maybe even staffed. And to be honest with you, there is a process by which we do this thing, and most other people seem to be able to follow it at some level. It may not be fast enough, and it may not be what you want, but we could work on improving that. And so I kind of talk about sides of the street using an old AA analogy here. We have to clean up our side of the street on the infrastructure picture and operations picture so that we can build some improving style organization, right, where we're learning together. And we also have to actually start to look at our cycle times and improve them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas that are longer term ideas, but could actually really start to help. First, I always like to understand how people are measured. Ellie Goldratt used to say, tell me how I'm measured and I'll tell you how I behave. And I think that there's very much truth to that. And a lot of problems we have are both the way we're measured, not getting the results that we want, and the unintended consequences of measurements. So in development, and by the way, I'm going to use a theory that was actually been developed by a partner of mine in the Global Transformation Office and a longtime close friend, Jabe Bloom. And Jabe is doing his PhD work right now at Carnegie Mellon in design. And he's literally doing transition design over long periods of time. So it's very relevant to the conversations we're having around transformation. And Jabe built this kind of theory called the Three Economies. And I suggest if you get a chance, look up Jabe Bloom, Jabe Bloom at Red Hat, and see his videos that he's done on the Three Economies. They're phenomenal. Also, his video on commenting, I think, is very, very important for this kind of platform focus. So in development, we're really talking about folks being praised, rewarded, maybe even financially compensated at some level for creating velocity, creating the notion of moving more features. We joke about features per second, right, as a measurement. But the big thing is you're going to generally hear qualitative measures. You're going to hear some quantitative around the amount that's pushed and how often it's pushed and how accurate it is. But most of these measures are actually what you would call variety measures, or how are you creating variation? In other words, what new things can we do that we couldn't do before? This is how Agile really works in a great way, which is creating more of that requisite variety in terms of how we meet these new customer needs. And also just how much of that we can do, right? So when you look at a lot of these measures, they're very focused on how much variety can we create, how fast. And if you're an engineer in an operations organization, an infrastructure organization, one of the things you're thinking in your mind is variety is not good, right? Because we have a whole different situations. But let's look at this from the perspective of business, right? There's a lot of different needs out there. There's just a variety of things that we can take on for our clients and ways that we can provide value in the space that we're working in. And so as the strategy helps us to select those things that are going to accomplish our goals, we're going to notice this left to right directionality, right? There's going to be a lot of variability with needs on the left. But on the right, we have a different economy that we're moving to, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you can see, just pose that development is measured on how much of that variety and how much of that velocity and how much of that output they create. Operations is measured on a completely different set of things. They are measured on scale. In other words, how many pieces of X can I manage with how many humans? So you hear things like server to sysadmin ratios, right? And you look at things like network coverage, right? And how do we actually start to make sure we have enough of the right people, but they have to be able to support many-to-one type of relationships, massive organizational many-to-ones. There's only so much in terms of service delivery and service support in IT that can actually exist, but there are many more business people than that. So that many-to-one relationships means IT, especially in a shared services context, is trying to serve a lot of people. And those people have a lot of different demands. So for the infrastructure organization, the rest of the company can feel like the left side. You guys have so many different needs that actually change all the time. The most important thing is different every week. And that's normal. So one of the things is like, how can we actually make this work for us instead of against us? This pattern of variety, but having to move to scale. Because the two of them don't talk really well to each other, right? They're measured on opposite things. And we all know from a security perspective, we can't have endless variety and have some notion that we're going to stay secure. So there has to be some known states. So infrastructure and operations primarily measured on reliability and scale, measures of how much to one can we manage. And we have to also understand that in many organizations, there is an expectation of an ever lowering cost. And you'll see this as an underlying emphasis. And there's this kind of cliche conversation about, is your technology driving business or is it a cost center? Well, I can argue that it's both all the time. And in many cases, we've been thought of as support to the business and these capabilities. But now more and more, these capabilities are emerging from technology and back into the business. So we need to understand how to actually go about this to create less of this chaos and less of this problem. So, we talk about the typical problem, and this picture goes back, I think originally this was Andrew Clay Schaefer's. I've seen it in Damon Edwards' decks, early days of DevOps conversations. We had this whole throw things over the wall from development into operation, right? And there's this kind of wall of confusion in between because operations couldn't unpack and necessarily understand all of the things that were happening, maybe even the components being used that are new, some of the new open source tools that may be bundled into that stuff, right? So the first thing you hear is, wow, you guys threw a thing at us and we have no way of understanding what all of this change really means from a security perspective, from an operational readiness perspective, and also just reliability. What is this going to mean? And then finally, how do we tip this thing back up after it falls over? What do we need to do? So these questions oftentimes are very much not answered. And, developers are having to be exposed to things that they shouldn't be exposed to in many cases to meet these operational needs. They're getting exposed to questions about primitives like storage, memory, right? The notion of network. And these are not things that most developers focus on in the enterprise, right? So they're like resenting that. And then the notion of the disintermediation through ticketing systems for developers is something that is really frustrating for them. Nobody wanting to fill out big forms that are in like Web 1.0 style to request changes and infrastructure, having to order literally every piece of a server, and then having it all arrived out of order, because when all that stuff goes into a ticketing system, sometimes it just turns into a blob of undifferentiated demand. So technology could be delivering things out of order because groups are working independently and tickets are divided into queues. Things can really be chaotic from that standpoint. So when you talk to developers about that frustration, it becomes a how many emails, how many tickets, and how many phone calls do I have over X period of time to get an environment, to actually try an idea. So that's a real concern. So these economies clash, and operations just cannot absorb all of this variety and meet its mission, right? And keep its promises of even reliability is a big concern, right? You'll find that ops people are very concerned with reliability because they get beat up when things don't seem reliable. And so if we look at kind of the ways that this can function in these three economies, the economy of development on the left, or what we're going to call differentiation, and then the economy of ops on the right, there's an interesting clutch that we can talk about, which are platforms. And if we talk about using platforms as a clutch to absorb variety from the differentiation and development side of things, and start to actually create what's called an economy of scope. In other words, scope doesn't run out. You can increase your scope, right? And the primitives that are used by operations, the storage, the memory, the compute, all of those pieces, they can understand because they're directing them at a known thing, a platform, right? And so that platform has a certain degree of stability, and they can reuse the things they build to deploy it, maintain it, and monitor it. And in a way, they can actually contribute those things back to the platform. They are bringing in capabilities to the platform from the operations side that they need to understand its telemetry, to understand, from an observability perspective, its security, automated attestation of events. So all of these things can happen in a platform when operations configures and builds and creates those tools to have that happen. And when they do it, they get a many-to-one benefit because a platform is less than building a lot of apps and having operations have to deal with discrete applications. their frameworks, their dependencies, right? Their libraries, all of those things which have to be vetted at some level from a security perspective. So what we really want to do is when we make all of those changes, we want to make them less, right? And we want to recommon them. In other words, take things that operations built to help run the platform, put them in the platform. Take the things that the developers learn and the hooks and tricks and things that they find that they can use in that platform, they contribute them back so that the operations people can know about them and use them, and so the platform teams can. So recommoning the things you build to support a platform back into the platform, really, really big deal. It's what keeps it vibrant, what keeps the scope and the community alive. So if we can absorb that variation in that platform, we can give operations fewer things to run versus discrete apps or apps aggregated into a platform. I'll take the platform all day because I know the path of security is looked at, the path of components are looked at, I have a thing to patch that I can understand, and I can maintain multiples of these things. Versus the garden variety of random application frameworks, libraries, and dependencies that may be my next security nightmare, my next reliability, and my protracted measurement of the time it takes to restore service. So I don't want to let my promises down because I can't understand what the thing is that I'm operating. But in this three economy scenario, you can begin to see how we can tame some of that variance and absorb variety in a platform, and then further reduce the variety and discrete amount of things that operations has to worry about. It allows them to scale more. This isn't the answer for everything. And matter of fact, I mean, some of our, even if we have the capability of doing this, one of the things that we're going to need to think about is how are we going to do it better, right? Because if we can use a platform as an interface, which would allow us, we make OpenShift here at Red Hat, and we've seen a lot of clients use this as an interface and use this as a way to start to bridge that scope economy. And I think it's important to understand there's a lot of platforms out there that will help you do this. At Red Hat, we're very opinionated about this, and we believe we have a great platform to help operations and infrastructure teams, as well as development teams, really accelerate that work and actually just change those behaviors, right? So a lot of people say, okay, well, how can we do this? How do we start? Because this is huge, right? And one of the reasons why I'm talking about this conversation about platforms as an interface is it's also a great discussion, the three economies, to have with folks that are really, really driving shadow IT. And eventually there will be somebody in this management chain that will understand what you're saying. We are not incentivized to do some of the things you're talking about, but some of the things you're talking about doing or have done actually make our jobs worse, put us all at risk, and jeopardize our reliability to our clients. So we do need to understand how to do this. Conversely, we got to get new stuff in, right? So how do we actually start to do this? And I think when we start to define an area together, both the business side and technology, to start improving flow, reducing cycle times, let's take some of that ammunition away that's used against technology orgs around cycle times, flow, delivered equality, right? But let's show them how we're improving that, so that they can not only see that we're improving because we're listening and we're partnering with them to solve business problems, but they can actually see a picture of the launch pad with the rocket on it and a timer. They can know what's happening. They can know where we're at in the countdown to getting things better. And finally, when we've improved things enough, they can see the rocket launch. That kind of confidence that's built from seeing continuous progress is amazing. And matter of fact, it builds a ton of social capital across the organization, compared to the scenario I talked about before, where we disinvest, we start to badmouth, because sometimes badmouthing is a way to differentiate ourselves. I'm not like that. So to get out of that blame modality, we have to get into the idea of, do you want to improve? And then we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to do that systematically? And I propose that we use an improvement method called the improvement kata, developed by Toyota. Mike Rother wrote about this in a seminal book called the Toyota Kata. Phenomenal book. The thing I love about it, the first few chapters just basically nail what I think is one of the best explanations of lean and some of these thinking tools and how they all fit together. This improvement method was missed by the lean community for a long, long time. We heard about all of the different little tools way before we heard about this from Toyota. And it was because Mike Rother noticed it wasn't something people talked about. It was something people had in their head. Steven Spear also wrote about this in his PhD argument, his whole central thesis was that Toyota was turning its line workers into scientists. And a lot of people kind of thought, gosh, that's pretty heady for a bunch of people that are assembling parts on a line. The same way people thought it was heady when I said that DevOps that are doing continuous improvement are scientists. Because centrally, continuous improvement is the scientific method, right? Whenever you look at the continuous movement katas that Toyota built, they're all around scientific experiments and developing scientific thinking. They just aren't telling you that. So when you solve problems, you develop a language to solve them scientifically, together, in a way that we can all understand where we're at. So one of the really important things is to take a lean technique called the A3, which literally is some information that fits on an A3 piece of paper. One of the logic guides being, if you can't fit it on that paper, it's not a problem. It's very, very important to define your problems in a way where you actually can say, how would we measure the situation or this target condition when it's working? And then what is the condition now? So if your problem statement defines the current condition and allows you to understand it and why that's not what we want, and then allows us to grasp the future direction, that is really, really important. And it's not only important because we need to say what would be different tangibly from a measurement standpoint, and that would be how we know we've hit that goal. So if I'm working at a workstation, to give an example that's pretty simple, and I want to increase my output of hammers per day, and I'm currently at 2, but my target condition for my work center is to put out 6, then my current condition is 2, my direction is 6, so my obstacle is 4. I have to figure out what's stopping me from getting more hammers out. So I'm going to list a few obstacles that are basic that I can see. I'm going to start experimenting on them. So you can see that using the A3 to define a problem really well is very, very important when you're doing experiments against it to solve it, because you need data to reference against to say, I've hit that point objectively, right? So one thing that's really important is that the closer you get to line workers in an organization, the more their world explodes into detail and specialty. And it's very, very important that whenever you focus on these things, you lay out visions. You got to remember your teams may see these as like a city far off, fuzzy, but they can see the shape. They can't make out the buildings. So it's really, really important to break this vision up or this goal into smaller pieces. And in the Toyota Kata, we refer to these as challenges, right? If we accomplish enough challenges together, we're going to hit the goal. But even challenges can be a little bit ambiguous for us working. So we want to create what's called a target condition. So if you think about it, for that person that was working at that work center making hammers, their target condition at where they worked was to put out more hammers, right? So one of the things to think about is a target condition describes the way it has to be when I'm working to actually allow me eventually, if we hit enough of these target conditions, to hit a challenge. So target condition is about the way you need to do your work and the measurements you need to do so that the overall organization can hit what they need to do. But you don't have to know all of that. You just need to know your target condition and your challenge. And so whenever we actually divide these up, we are building a systematic way to tear these problems apart and also for us to improve together. So one thing I want to talk to you about here is in this scenario, I mentioned to you an improvement mechanism. The first thing is that from a homework perspective, you've got to watch Jabe's Three Economies and the talks that we're doing from the Global Transformation Office about the 5 elements. Very, very, very important conversations that Jabe and Andrew Clay Schaefer are having. You're also going to want to check out the conversations that John Willis is having about automated governance. Trusted software supply chain, automated governance, these things are emerging as some of the most important conversations. And unless we have a fundamental systematic improvement method that allows us to escape from learned helplessness, which is basically what happens to us in a corporate environment over time, because we can do the right thing, and a lot of times the results don't happen for a long time, and they're not what we expect. So we learn how to get the cheese just like the mice in this experiment. But after a while, when the cheese starts showing up in different places with no relationship to what we're doing, we stop. And that can be corporate America, right? We break all of the social rules, a lot of the trust rules, and a lot of our ability to multitask style rules. Some weird stuff can happen. So one of the ways to undo this is to really focus on a scientific improvement cycle. And this book that came out after the Toyota Kata. So I would definitely suggest that you pick up, and depending on your stomach for getting into lean and manufacturing, at first, at least read the first few chapters of the Toyota Kata until you find that maybe it's not what you're looking for. If you're like me, or if you're really interested in systems and production, or maybe even work in that field, this book is compelling. I love Toyota Kata. It's one of my favorite reads. And by the way, you can go work with Mike Rother up in University of Michigan, and they hold courses as well to actually, do this with teams. And I've been up there. I've done it. Mike is fantastic, and so is Bill. I can't say enough good things about him. I've taken teams of people up there. It's something I would recommend whenever we're allowed to travel again. So the other thing is that when you pick up this practice guide that he put out, which I think is even more valuable in a lot of ways, because it comes down to how do you do this, right? If you're a manager or if you're a team leader, you're saying, gosh, I have to learn how to second coach. I'm not sure what that is. So what I want you guys to do is read this Toyota Kata practice guide. And if you're brave, and I think most of you are, crack open the first few chapters of the Toyota Kata to really get an understanding of some of the background, where it was coming from. I just love the way Mike describes things. Very rich language. Also, if you're an engineer, you'll appreciate some of Mike's thinking. So the questions I want you to answer while you read this is, hey, is it okay for me to run longer experiments? I'm asking you questions here that you're going to start to have to answer from your people if you're second coaching them, right? This technique reassigns what second coaching or management at the director and above level actually does with folks. It takes them away from micromanaging you and solving a lot of things for you, right? So again, this is about empowering folks to make decisions closest to the edge where the most intelligence is. So is it okay to run a longer experiment? You're going to have to figure this out. There are advantages to long experiments. There are advantages to short experiments. But in the kata, there is a very, very big bias towards one or the other. So figure that out. Also, coaches solve problems to help us improve? Yes or no? We need to understand this so we know that coaches know what to do, right? What is the correct number of obstacles to list when you are building your picture of the current condition, right? The target condition, and then how many obstacles should you bother listing? Should you come up with everything you can think of? How do you order them, right? So, and then the next question is target is short for target condition? Do they mean the same thing? Can I use them interchangeably? And then there's one last thing that may be a little tough for you to derive out of this. And you may not find it exactly here. You will find it in the Toyota Kata, but you also can find it in general lean and manufacturing knowledge. What is takt time? It's very, very important to know this. And you're going to start to ask yourself a fundamental question in your technology organization if you get this concept. We don't know what takt time is for a lot of the things that we produce. And that's something very, very important when you're talking about improvement, grasping a current condition. What would be the takt time of the delivery cycles that you would actually be able to satisfy business with? So, done a lot of talking here and a lot of theorizing with you, but also some practical guidance pieces about how we actually need to think and how we need to focus on improvement. And here's the thing that I would invite. I think here is the $64,000 piece in this. If by actually getting this stuff going at some level in your organization, by this stuff, I'm talking about a lucid set of improvement cycles that are around a problem that the business agrees is real, you have a chance to partner in continuous improvement, not just broadcast or use it to legitimize what you're doing. But you have a chance to partner and ask to work on this together. And as your partners begin to see how seriously you take improvement, and you got to take it seriously, you will start to build social capital with other people because they will see you doing a thing that people in their org do not do in a structured way in many cases. They will also see your effort and your constant questioning and your curiosity and your scientific approach to getting close to meeting their needs. You may not be able to do it, but you also may be able to explain to them the economies and why it is that your teams together need to focus on building the capabilities that are in front of you. In other words, there probably, if you're a normal org, is a backlog of capabilities that the org needs to develop in order to participate in the reality that is, the direction everybody's heading. So partnering on improvement both increases the visibility of it, but the relevance of it as well. And it's important that the folks that are partnering have an understanding of what it looks like and basically can understand the mechanics. So again, a lot of words, love to go into more detail on this. And, Yasser really made a great point. Now this will be the third in this episode series that we've done on some lessons from the Phoenix Project. You'll see the hooks to this in the Phoenix Project in the sense of you're going to have to notice how the technology org learned the hard lessons, Patty having all of the changes on a Kanban board, right? And realizing that they're just not moving, right? All of these things require movement. I often say everything everybody does in technology probably results in an infrastructure change at some point. But I don't know that that's totally true. But you got to think about it. We're all working towards a thing. And basically, most of us are working towards making change happen that brings business value. So if we're doing that, we need to work together and we need to improve together. And part of that improving means cross-functional problem solving. No longer do we just take it inside of our tribe or inside of our local optima and work on it ourselves, but we need to consider the global optima as we're moving constraints together or addressing and managing them, and as we're dealing with all of the concerns that we have. So if we follow the theory of constraints, we understand that the problem is not just solving the problem, it is actually managing it long term. So with that, I've got a lot of questions I'm seeing in here, Yasser. There's a ton of stuff popping up in the question box. We should probably get to some of these.
Yeah, absolutely. Am I on here? Can you hear me?
Yep, you're on. You're live.
Okay. So first of all, wonderful overview as always, Kevin. It's always great to see the passion for this topic. And just as a quick summary, as Kevin said, shadow IT is really about lack of trust. Consumerization is actually accelerating this as well. So why it's more important now than ever to actually make sure we improve or we may lose. And we don't want that to happen to anybody here. And ops and dev are measured in different ways, sometimes even opposite. So he introduced this concept of the platform in the middle, as he called it, as a clutch to absorb or allow all of the differentiation, not all, but it absorbs and allows a lot of the differentiation that dev needs, but provides that manageability that ops is looking towards. So it was great. Also, you talked about the how to start by undertaking the improvement kata, as well as using A3 approach, and ended with some really, really fantastic homework as well. So really, we're continuing the theme. For those of you who've been with us from the beginning, we're continuing the theme of the way that you transform, be it professionally or personally, is if you don't transform, it's really about improving or losing in some other way. Today, we're talking about shadow IT. So with that, a couple questions for you, Kevin. We only have about 10 minutes. So you mentioned about how to start with engagement and partnering. You talked about cross-functional. You talked about how this can all create social capital. So the idea being, hey, the first step is you need to engage. You need to really talk. So the question is, how do you start that discussion? There may already be some tension. There may already be people moving to shadow IT. How can you let people know that this is an earnest move forward? And what if they don't want to engage? So how can we get everybody involved in this together?
I mean, oftentimes, to be honest with you, social capital can be so bad in some of the existing situations, right? That there are these kind of portal windows that you have to make sure you use. So, the saying being never let a good crisis go to waste. Any particular time that you can actually start to build a question or foreshadow the need for this conversation with your peers, it's really important. And I think the best way to do it sometimes, if you've got some open hostility, is to literally come forward with a bended knee and humility, right? I'm not saying I'm wrong, but what I'm saying is if we're in a transformation together, which is a process for the whole company, it means that we have to transform the capabilities of an operation as well. In this case, infrastructure and operations, right? And so I think it's really, really important to use this conversation to frame, hey, if I understand how you're measured, I can understand how you might behave, right? What might cause that? So how are you being measured in a way where I'm hurting you? How am I hurting you? Not as a defensive question, right? Not going, how am I actually hurting you, right? No, what we're saying here is very, very honestly, asking to understand. And I think this is what happens in our organizations. We talk past each other so fast. And so really taking time to sit and listen, and actually listen from a vulnerable place where it could hurt if they say the right thing. And because we need to feel what they're feeling. It's not about just feeling their pain, air quote, but it's also understanding the context so that when you propose a solution to the problem, it doesn't just sound like you said you need it fast, so we're going to work on faster. We could both agree that that's the thing, but we might do that and not solve your problem. So that interaction throughout it, working together. Hey, does this feel better? How about this? Does this feel better? Hey, look what we were able to do here. The small updates versus the big bang. That's what builds social capital, and that's what builds the partnership, right? And then also being able to say in humility, I don't know what you mean. And as technology folks, we feel this unbearable pressure sometimes to know everything about technology, and we just can't. So being a partner means you're honest, and being a reliable partner means you say what you can and can't do. So it's important to be able to say to somebody, I can't do that right now, but boy, do you see this as a growing thing we're going to need to be able to do? Oh, wow, we got to be able to do that. Crap. I wonder what we could stop doing that we're doing now. Maybe we could free up some capacity, right? And I think that's one of those things about rules that we have to understand is a lot of times we put solutions in to get rid of limitations, but we don't change the fundamental rule that we use to cope with them before we had the limitation. If we don't get the benefit. So one of the big things is that we need to understand together that in order to build, to co-build and co-create as a company, reliable solutions and infrastructure that deliver to our customers and bring value, it has to be a partnership at the demand level and the fulfillment level. We can't just have undifferentiated demand. What we wind up with is champagne taste on a beer budget. And so, of course, somebody's going to take their Amex and go out and buy champagne. And so what we have to do as a company is say, listen, this is not about you guys making decisions that are best for your optima. We have to protect everybody. And I think that that's what's important is if we can move together as trusting folks, that really decides how fast we move, not whether we bought it with a credit card.
Yeah, and Kevin, that's a great point. It came up to another question, which was very related, and I think you covered already, which was how do you motivate different sides? And ultimately, everyone has needs. So the people that are doing shadow IT, they have needs. And the problem, as everyone on this call probably has been in IT long enough to know that when someone goes shadow IT, oftentimes they're doing it on their own. They're not the most technologically enabled, let's say. And as you said, they may swipe a credit card and get some instant gratification, but then you might hear about it at some other point. So to kind of summarize, go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to say, I mean, the place that nobody wants it to show up is at a board meeting where somebody's questioning an audit finding, where audit found that somehow something slipped into production and didn't. May have even been SaaS, right? It might have been a software as a service that we bought, who said they were secure, said that they passed all of these things, but operations never got to review it, right? So it could be an audit finding, and sometimes the business actually has to apologize for what they've done, right? I've seen this happen, but what's more important than the apology is how do we rectify this moving forward? How do we not end up here all the time? And that takes collaboration.
Yeah, that was beautiful. And as you said, the social capital, and you talked about really the approach you talked about is really taking a vulnerable, needs-based, curious position when you begin that engagement. And that takes some work. It's not an easy thing to do, especially if there's feelings of, not being appreciated, all that type of stuff. So the answer was great, Kevin. It's just, that's something for all of us to kind of consider. How do we actually do that? Someone's got to take the first step. Go ahead.
Motivation. I was just going to say motivation to do the work is that, we're motivated on a very negative side. We don't like how this feels when it happens to us, either way, right? I want to feel like I have a partner in my technology folks that is going to help me. I don't want to feel stranded. I know that I don't know everything, but what I don't want to hear is no to everything. So I need to understand. So the motivation for me is I'm trying to get a thing done, right? And your motivation is I'm trying to make sure we keep promises and do them reliably and that we can meet our budgets. So we don't have to be opposites. How about we're going to get the thing done the most secure, cheapest, fastest way possible, right? And what we're going to do so that we're not settling for that, we're going to improve how we deliver that over time, and you can watch and help.
Yeah, and as Kevin said, he talked about approaching that conversation with a very different mindset. And as we've been saying, for those of you who've been with us, personal transformation and professional transformation are very similar. All of us can probably think of situations where that type of an approach would be a lot more effective than going and swinging and feelings hurt. So that's a great example, Kevin. So
Yes.
we have time
All right.
for one more question, Kevin. So we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask you if you could do this really briefly because we don't have too much time, which is simply, what are some examples of challenges in taking the platform approach? We get the benefits of the clutch of being able to allow for more differentiation while also being able to manage it. What are some of the challenges to keep in mind in just a couple of minutes?
So the first thing is that you're going to have to explain this to everybody. So it's important that people understand the general direction of the organization is to embrace platform economies, right? We're going to have more variation than ever. Explain why we need to absorb those in the platforms. Almost like a dream catcher, I always joke, right? It's the idea. All of our various things that we want to try and do can be caught and channeled in a platform. So one of the biggest challenges is understanding that organizationally as a direction. Also creating a situation where people are rewarded to adding to that scope economy. In other words, adding something that makes value for everybody, potentially. It can scale over time, right? And so instead of making an app that gets hidden under a bush, right? It may solve the bird's problem, but it doesn't solve the lion's problem. And so I think the thing that we need to understand is when we are using an economy where we're trying to create this scope economy, we actually need to incent the other two economies to work with the scope economy. And so it's important to understand that when you're hearing these complaints from developers about primitives, I have to file 34 tickets, and I have to go talk to 3 people, and then I got to call 2 people on the phone to get an environment to test something that takes me 5 minutes, right? Or all of the parts that I order come out of order. So I've got the headlight from a 62 Nova, I've got a case from a server, I've got a CPU chip, and I got a box with an application in it. What am I supposed to do with this, right? So we actually need to understand how to hear that language because it's all over the place. It's subtle. So operations people need to understand, and it's important to message, listen for those kinds of things. If it's too much assembly required and it's undifferentiated delivery because our ticketing system turns it into undifferentiated demand by putting it into queues and having separate teams work on things, they're all going to deliver at the same different times, right? So what is the experience we want to have? We have to communicate that over and over to the org. This is the way it needs to become, right? And I think we keep talking about becoming rather than attainment because this is a continual thing. That's why I was talking about using continuous improvement. One simple challenge, X percentage of our new features get deployed to a platform, right? Over time, we see X amount of apps that are freestanding migrate to platform functionality, increasing our scale, right? So being able to communicate those broad intents in a way where we can measure them discreetly is really, really important.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. I think that's a fantastic end to a fantastic journey on this 3-part webinar. So I want to thank you, first of all, for taking the time to put all this together. And I do hope that you find the inspiration to continue doing so. And I want to thank everyone for joining, everyone else who helped to put this together. And finally, we were just scratching the surface today. So we can set up an executive exchange with Red Hat Global Transformation Office, which includes Kevin and some of the other luminaries, and they can engage with your leadership. Because one of the hardest things we always hear is, oh yeah, I get it, but my leadership. So we can help you help your organization. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy your day. We hope you're safe and healthy, and we look forward to reconnecting at some point.